The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we will be speaking with Dr. Bernard Toney, a former White House medical officer skilled at collaborating with governmental agencies, non-governmental partners, and global partners to develop medical plans, infectious disease migration strategies, and public health preparedness at the highest level of government. He is a highly decorated Army combat veteran with over 35 awards, who served in 3 tours in Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Currently, Dr. Toney is an associate investigator at the National Institute of Health, where he conducts clinical research on vascular inflammation, aiming to understand how the immune system, blood factors, and vascular networks interact and lead to vascular diseases. Dr. Toney, welcome to the show from Maryland.
Thank you so much for having me, Doug and Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. You have a very interesting life story, one that's remarkable in accomplishments. Can you share your life story with our viewers?
Yes, thank you for the question. And just as a disclaimer, I know I heard it at the outset, but my comments or remarks don't represent the United States government nor the National Institutes of Health. They're my opinions and my opinions alone. But yeah, absolutely. I would love to, sort of start off with, where I'm from. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. I joined the Army at a very young age. I joined the Army at 17 years of age. And I joined the Army under some pretty dire circumstances. Many people know a lot about my story, but for your viewers who don't, I joined the Army right on the heels of a drive-by shooting, which was really traumatic, in which I lost my best friend, Ivan Gray, in that shooting. That was in March of 1999. I'm dating myself here. But in April of 1999, I was already serving in basic combat training in the Army. And after joining the Army, I had a very interesting career. It was serpiginous and sort of meandering in many ways. I was also a student at Troy University a long time ago as well. But then at some point, I ended up, after a 21-year career, I had a capstone assignment working at the White House Medical Unit between the years of 2018 to 2022, in which I had the opportunity, if you look at those years, to serve 2 presidents. Now I'm currently practicing medicine at the National Institutes of Health and doing a lot of other global health and public health initiatives as well with my nonprofit organization.
Excellent. You've worked with some very impressive people, and you have really, I think, a very amazing background. Do you have any interesting anecdotes from these encounters with the people that you've worked with? And what were some things you learned through these encounters?
Oh, geez. I mean, I've worked with so many interesting people. Obviously, not many people can say that they served under 2 presidential administrations. And in that capacity, I also provided direct support to both presidents, President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden, but also worked very closely with the vice presidents, Vice President Mike Pence and Vice President Kamala Harris, and the first ladies of the United States as well. I can tell you, though, that although I did a lot of that really high profile work, really the anecdotes that resonate with me, most readily is the people who don't have a voice, if you will, people who kind of clean the hallways of the White House and things like that. And those are the people who really, when I look back at much of my time, those were the people who really gave me a lot of reason to want to show up, because they showed up every single day to support us and to do everything that we do on a daily basis. So honestly, while working for very senior officials, supporting cabinet members, taking care of cabinet members and all of the White House staff, honestly, it was the people who were, working in the kitchens, the Navy mess, cleaning the halls of the White House. Those were the people who really made things function so we can do our good work protecting the president and the vice president.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we're about to enter into a new election season, and age is an important issue in the upcoming elections for both parties. So, what concerns you from a medical perspective about candidates who are advanced in age?
That's a very interesting question, and I hear it as almost like a political football going back and forth. While not a very political person myself, and even at the White House Medical Unit, the military is apolitical, and that's for obvious reasons. I can tell you that age isn't as much as an indicator of whether or not a person has a capacity to lead, as opposed to their health status. And I think that I can certainly point to people in their 60s who may not have the capacity based on their health conditions to lead an organization or the country for that matter. And the same goes for people who are a little bit more advanced in age. I think as long as there's a capacity to be able to lead effectively and have good decision making capability, and to surround yourself with a good team of people who are going to help guide that decision making. With the president, that would be the cabinet members. I think that's of vital importance, and I think that the number, in many ways, is sort of an abstraction that doesn't have a whole lot of value, as opposed to one's ability to lead based on their capacity. And that's assured by the White House physician. Every president has a physician that's assigned to them by their choosing, and that person does the due diligence of doing a physical exam and all the other things that are required to make sure that the president is of good health. I would also add that we have a great continuity of government. If something were to happen, in large part, that's the reason why I served at the White House Medical Unit, was to ensure that continuity of government. If the leader of the free world, the president, for whatever reason, is incapacitated, that's the reason why we have a vice president, and on down the line. So again, to your question, I think it's really a matter of the individual, and less a number that I will be able to point to say whether or not a person's going to be effective as a leader.
I like that. I like that response. What was it like to work in the White House, and what were some of the difficulties and lessons you learned there? And how did your military background prepare you for this work?
Thank you for that question. The White House Medical Unit was definitely it was a blessing. I would have never imagined myself, again, with my humble beginnings in Atlanta, Georgia, imagine myself working in the halls of the White House and traveling around the world with the presidential administration. I can tell you that it was an honor. I think that irrespective of what a person's political affiliation is, the honor of serving the office of the president and the office of the vice president is something that is very rare. And for me, it was, I was a first time college graduate in my family. I was a lot of firsts in my family, but that was something that my mom was able to point to and say, I think my son is somebody important at this point. But I think it was also a opportunity for service in many different ways that I would have never imagined in the military. While I was serving at the White House Medical Unit, that entire unit is primarily made up of the different branches of service. So as an Army officer, I was still in the Army while assigned there. And again, it was an opportunity for me to be able to execute leadership, but servant leadership, by taking care of the people that take care of the rest of the country. Again, that was an amazing opportunity for me. My preparedness for that position was based on the fact that I had a lot of training that allowed me to be able to employ certain skill sets if needed. So going through a lot of emergency medicine type of training, I attended the flight surgeon school, which allowed me to be able to understand how to take care of patients at altitude and different types of aircraft, whether or not they were fixed aircraft or rotary wing aircraft, helicopters. And so all of these different skill sets, to include already having a top secret security clearance, prepared me and laid the ground framework, or the foundation, if you will, for me to be able to step into that role and to be within arm's reach of the president at all times.
Fantastic. I have a quick question related to that, and that is that you've spent time in both medicine. You've got a career in the medicine and the military. Does this juxtaposition help you in understanding national security implications related to viruses and other biological diseases, such as what we saw during the pandemic?
Absolutely. For any soldier or military member, for that matter, that's deployed during OEF, Operation Enduring Freedom, and potentially even Iraqi freedom, we all got an anthrax vaccination series. So we were all acutely aware of biological threats that would be, that could be employed by, enemy of the United States. And so, even just as a recipient of, of that vaccine, I think that many military members understood what biological threats are. The pandemic was much more acute and in much more recent memory for people. I think it speaks to the fact that many of the diseases that can cause significant burden on the country and the world at large are zoonotic diseases. That means they originate in animals and jump into the human's immune system. And so I think that we learned a lot about these zoonotic diseases in the COVID-19 pandemic. But to your point, it definitely highlights the fact that global health and global health security are something that needs to be top of mind in our national security strategy. It should be something that informs our decision making, and we should always have ways to be able to mitigate against that threat and prepare against that threat if we need to.
Excellent. I'm going to follow that up by turning it a little bit, but one implication from the previous question, the U.S. gets much of its medicine from China and India. How is this a problem given the increasing tensions with China? Is there anything the U.S. should be doing to resolve this issue?
That's a great question. Again, one of those interesting political talking points that a lot of people have, and as an apolitical person, I feel in a safe space to be able to, voice my opinion on the matter. We live in this interconnected, interdependent world with respect to our economies, with respect to, our global supply chains. There's really no way to disentangle that. So I think, what we have to do is we have to figure out a way to continue to work, across international borders in a very competitive way, like we always have, but have, the backstop of being able to secure our supply chains from a national security perspective. And let me give a good example. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many of the supply chains were disrupted. I couldn't get furniture for 5 or 6 months when I moved into my new home because of that disruption. That's not critical. What's critical, though, are our vaccines and our medications and things like that. So I think what we need to do is we need to have a way to continue to work in an interconnected and collaborative way to advance science, to advance our ability to be innovative and create new pharmaceuticals. But I think we need to evaluate what are our critical points where if we did not have access to certain, raw materials for certain pharmaceuticals or vaccines, what would that do to our national security and our ability to govern and to be able to do our jobs as leaders within the country? Those things, I think we need to have redundancy. And I think that redundancy needs to be produced in the United States or have the capacity to scale up and reproduce that in the United States. But I still think we need to be able to work, across international borders and find areas of collaboration and cooperation.
Fantastic. COVID's now turned into an endemic disease, and it will be around for a long time to come. And yet, COVID as a pandemic took us almost completely by surprise, despite the fact that a lot of people had been urging us to be prepared for a pandemic. Now, given the fact that you served during COVID, how would you evaluate our policy responses in retrospect? And what could we have done differently?
It's a tale. It's a tale of two worlds essentially. Where if you look at how we were able to scale up, massively scale up our ability to bring in the science that was already existing, to be able to incorporate new knowledge and data points to be able to advance vaccines and therapeutics, Operation Warp Speed, being able to leverage the whole of government, whole of society approach is unprecedented. And I think that's something that we can stand on as the United States of America, as leaders in that regard, because I think we did a phenomenal job with respect to being able to scale up that level of response, from mitigation to adaptation, to be able to protect the citizens of the United States. Where I think we made some miscalculation, and if I can be candid with you, is our communication campaign. That wasn't the only thing, but I think that was something that really stood out to me, and it's a consequence of, again, the beauty of our great nation. Looking at the 10th Amendment, we have federalism, in which we have things that are not within the purview of the federal government. They lie within the realm of the states. And so each state had their own mitigation plan, their own public health departments, their own leaders that they were looking to for knowledge. And at sometimes, and many times throughout the pandemic, that information was at odds. It was confusing. It wasn't coordinated or synchronized in many ways. And so you end up having a pandemic that affected the United States, but really it affected 50 different states differently. And so I think what we need to do moving forward is to figure out a way to, while maintaining our federalism as it stands, because that's one of the beauty, the great things of our nation, but figure out a way to increase that communication and coordination. A tangible thing that comes top of mind is the way that we deliver healthcare in the United States. Again, many things are governed by the states, and that means you have 50 different versions of the same thing. The Veterans Affairs, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA health system, is constructed in a way that if I had a license to practice in the VA in Florida, I can go over to California, and be credentialed in the hospital and continue working in that hospital in the same system without changing my license, without changing my license, my PA license from Florida to California. We need solutions like that, because that was a significant barrier, with being able to deploy nurses and doctors and other allied health professionals to the critical points where they're most needed, because of these barriers with respect to licenses and things like that. If we can figure out a way to have a unified system that allows for people to move across different state lines rapidly in response to a pandemic, while also understanding that the states need the ability to maintain the governing of the license, and if there needs to be any punitive actions taken, that's within the purview of the states. That's something that we should look at, and I think the VA health system is a great model for that. That's one great example of a technical thing that we can do from a legislative and a policy standpoint to prepare for the next pandemic. But again, one of the significant challenges that we'll have moving forward is how do you communicate in a synchronized way so that people are getting the same information from reputable sources, that's repeated over time, and when things are updated, is updated across the entire footprint of our nation. That's something that we had a significant challenge with, and I think that's something that we need to look forward in the future.
Excellent. I'm going to follow that up and say, what do you think COVID taught us about the dangers of a pandemic? Is it likely we will face another pandemic, and how prepared will we be?
That's subjective. You talk to 10 different people and you probably get 10 different answers. I'll tell you that we need to keep it at top of mind. The COVID-19 pandemic already sounds like, history for a lot of people. But I think what we've learned during the pandemic is that viruses don't respect borders, whether they're international borders or state borders. And so going back to my earlier point of working in a collaborative way, we need to make sure that we foster a international collaborative agreement, in a way that we're moving forward collectively to prepare against these global zoonotic threats, these zoonotic diseases. That means that we need to invest, more heavily in international development. I think a lot of these diseases that crop up are oftentimes cropping up in places that are low and middle income countries, or resource poor settings. And a lot of times the detection and ability to identify and detect these epidemiologic threats are a big significant challenge for us. So I think we need to figure out ways to help other countries that are vulnerable develop and bolster their capability to be able to assist in responding to many of these threats. I think that I don't have a crystal ball, but I will tell you that we're living closer and closer to many of these animals that these diseases jump from into humans. So I think the threat of having another global pandemic is something that's realistic. How soon would that happen? I'm not entirely sure, But I can tell you that without any equivocations, I think we will have another pandemic, and it can have even more serious consequences than what COVID-19 had.
Perfect. I want to ask you briefly, given your many um, life experiences, what have been some of the lessons that have stood out for you that you've learned along the way that you could share with our viewers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when you look at the burden of disease, COVID-19, every disease has a certain, certain way that it infects people, the virulence, how infectious it is, how severe it can be. I think what we learned was that in all of this, with the great research that been able to employ to be able to mitigate COVID-19, was we identified the inequities that exist within the United States. If you look at the people who had significant burden of disease, it ran along certain socioeconomic lines, it ran along certain marginalized populations that were more affected than others. So I think what we learned was is that while this was a disease that was, very deleterious on our nation writ large, we also uncovered some of the ugly truths of inequity. And so that inequity needs to be addressed. I think many of our leaders, public health leaders, have spoken to this fact, extensively throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think it was a blessing and a curse. And I think the blessing is that we uncovered many of these social inequities that we identify in the public health realm as social determinants of health. That may not be health related, but things like having access to healthy grocery stores and having access to transportation, living wages. All of these things affect certain populations worse than others, and those were the populations who were most significantly burdened by the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it creates a great opportunity for us to be able to move things in the right direction to help decrease the inequity that exists in the United States.
Excellent. I have another follow-up question, and I'd like to talk about what you're doing now. What is your current research, and also you're part of an organization that's designed to that you do outside of the National Institute of Health. Can you talk about what you do with that and your current research?
Yeah, without going into a lot of granular detail, I work in vascular medicine and we study, vascular diseases. Can't really specifically talk about different protocols and things like that, but we work in a way to help figure out ways to identify, diagnose, and treat rare diseases and many other common diseases that primarily affect the vascular system. And that's what I do in my day job. What I do in my, my off time, if you will, is if I have any off time, I'm a board chair of a nonprofit organization called Stepping Stones for Global Development. My passion, in many ways, is being able to address many of those social inequities that I spoke about previously. And we work with marginalized populations or low to middle income populations to be able to bring healthcare solutions that are both capacity building and sustainable. And so most recently, we've been able to deploy out to Ecuador and help them with from a maternal health and cervical cancer screening perspective, also doing some primary care. And also gave a recent talk with their leadership from a medical perspective of how to prepare for El Nino, these extreme weather events. And that's so timely as we're seeing extreme weather events here in the United States as well.
Fantastic. We've got limited time left, but I'd like to ask you if you had any advice for the 17-year-old kid that you went into the Army at that time. What would that advice be? What would you tell the up-and-coming generation about life in general that you think would be important for them to hear?
I would say never give up. Many times in my career, and in fact, most times in my career, my leadership saw something in me that I couldn't really see in myself. So I think that speaks to two things. I think that speaks to finding good mentors, people who have been in the place that you want to be, irrespective of where you are right now. I think that's very essential. And because we live in a much more interconnected world than I did when I was growing up. I think that's much easier to get access to people who are very influential, very impactful. I think that's something that if I were 17 years old again, I would tell myself as a teenager, Bernard Toney, find the person or the people who you most resonate with and find a way to connect with them, because those are going to be, that's the framework, that's the groundwork, if you will, for being able to fall into your place, move in your direction, but with some guidance. At 17 years old, I didn't have much guidance, as evidenced by some of the choices that I made in high school, and things of that nature. But I was allowed to tether myself to people who had my best interest in mind. And that was game changing for me. And that happened sequentially over my career in a very iterative way. And I'm a product of great mentorship and leadership in the United States Army that's been able to help groom me in a way to be a leader.
Excellent. And you did study at Troy University. What role does education play in advancement for people in coming from difficult backgrounds?
Great question. I think education, again, as a social determinant of health, is one of the most fundamental things that we can focus on because it speaks to so many other elements of life. It speaks to life expectancy. It speaks to opportunity, and that opportunity allows people to, lift themselves up out of their conditions, whether it's relative poverty, extreme poverty, or just in a place where you're just not happy with where you are. I think education has been my vehicle to be able to do so many different things and continue to be a vehicle for me. I just, at 42 years old, I just completed a Master of Public Health degree from George Washington University. Later in life, and that again is another vehicle for me to be able to impact others. So I think education, as early as we can possibly impart that the importance of it on our youth, that is the most salient thing that we can do as leaders, as parents, as community members. Because as you look across the United States, we have a lot of school districts, to include the ones that I grew up in, where people are still struggling from an education perspective. And I think that we have to find ways, creative solutions, to not only heighten the importance of it, but also bring the resources to bear where they're most needed from an education perspective.
Bernard, I want to thank you so much. I've learned a lot from our conversation, and I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. It's been truly an honor for us to speak to you and to learn more about your background. Thank you so much.
Doug, Michael, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Although I didn't graduate from Troy University, I'm always a member or part of Troy University. So again, thank you for having me.
Thank you
It was
so
a great
much.
honor, yes, and you're always in our family, so the university.